Welcome to the 29th episode of the Learn XP podcast. Today I'm talking with Doug Belshaw about badges and its use as verifiable credentials or open recognition. In addition to exploring the benefits of badges and many recommendations, we get some practical hints on how to start using badges. Now let's start with the interview. Hi Doug, do you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, yeah. Hi, I'm Doug Belshaw. I'm a founding member of We Are Open Cooperative, and we tend to focus on helping everyone work more openly, but especially around learning, technology, and community. I used to work for Mozilla. I was their web literacy lead, and before that, I was on the Open Badges team, which is obviously related to what we're talking about today. I wrote my doctoral thesis on digital literacies. I did a TED Talk around that, and I wrote an ebook. And before that, I worked in higher education for JISC, which is an organization well known in the UK. And I started my career as a teacher and senior leader in UK schools. And over and above lots of badges, I've got degrees in philosophy, modern history, and education.
Sounds like many interesting topics, so maybe we have to do more episodes about all the other stuff that you've done. But today we want to focus on verified credentials and open recognition. Maybe you can briefly explain, you've also worked on the open badges for Mozilla. Why is this relevant for you?
So I was sitting there in an office working in higher education in 2011, and my daughter had just been born. She's almost 12 years old now, and my son was only small as well. And I remember I kind of just finishing off my thesis, and I'd spent 27 years in formal education, and then this thing called open badges came along, which seemed to allow anyone to issue badges for anything, and I thought, this is amazing. This means that all of a sudden, anyone can be recognized for the stuff that they're good at, rather than having to go through the very formal route. I should probably explain that I grew up in at a kind of middle-class family, but in a very working-class area, just after all the mines had shut and there was lots of unemployment and all that kind of stuff. And just seeing how, for a lot of people, their route out of poverty, out of certain areas, was through credentials. I just thought if you could democratize the means of credentialing, that would be such a powerful thing to do. So I kind of wanted to make that a reality. I wanted to make open badges a thing which was normal in society. And so I guess I started a journey, which 11 years later has led me to here. Yeah.
No, so really a driving purpose for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I always ask my guest for a quote. Maybe related to the topic. Did you also bring a quote?
I did, yeah. I don't know how related it is to the topic, although I do read and continue to kind of study a lot of ancient Greek philosophy. And there was a philosopher called Epictetus. And Epictetus was actually lame, people think, based on the writings. And he was an escaped slave. And he had his own school of philosophy. And one of my favorite quotations from him, which I actually have on my Mastodon profile, is don't explain your philosophy, embody it. So instead of spending forever trying to explain what you stand for, just live your life through that organizing principle. And that's what I try to do.
Wow. Yeah. Don't explain your philosophy, but embody it. So you have to live it and be it and not explain it. Yeah. And don't recognize it, right?
Yeah, and don't make excuses and say, oh, well, like just if you're committed to something, do it. Let your life be your there's a football manager near us. It says, make today be your masterpiece. Make your life be your masterpiece. Like live your life intentionally.
Yeah. So this is very strong. Very nice. Thank you very much for this. And today we want to talk about verified credentials and open recognitions. So maybe you can define or briefly explain what this is about. I have a rough idea, but yeah.
Yeah, for sure. So lots of people listening to this podcast will probably have come across open badges over the last 11 years in some form or other. At different times, it's been kind of the red hot topic. So Mozilla was, and we'll go through the history of this later on, but Mozilla was around, was the inventor of open badges. But the reason that we're talking about verifiable credentials and open recognition today is because things have moved on a little bit. And so verifiable credentials is a W3C standard. So W3C is the World Wide Web Consortium, and they look after the standards, which means that no matter what a browser you use, you can access websites, Firefox, Chrome, Brave, whatever it is. And verifiable credentials isn't just a learning standard. So open badges is primarily around, you learning things and skills and that kind of stuff. But verifiable credentials is literally anything that you need to prove. So that could be your passport, your driving license, your identity card, those kinds of things. And the idea is that you have some kind of wallet or backpack or some safe space where you can store those to be able to prove what you know, what you can do, who you are, that kind of thing. So Open Badges has been through several specification iterations from version 1 in 2012 up to version 3, which has only just been ratified. And version 3 of the Open Badges specification aligns directly with verifiable credentials, so that when you're issuing version 3 of the Open Badges specification, you're literally also issuing verifiable credentials. The two are interoperable with one another. So that is basically making Open Badges quite high stakes. It's saying that you could issue badges for PhDs and for government-issued IDs and that kind of thing. So on the other side of things is open recognition. And open recognition is almost the opposite of credentialing, although the two are quite closely related. So, Matthias, if I issued you a badge for being an awesome podcast host, I'm not just issuing you a credential, I'm also recognizing you, and we're establishing a relationship between me as a listener or a participant and you as the podcast host. So every time a credential is issued, there's also recognition between two parties. It could be an organization and an individual. It could be two organizations, could be two individuals. And so what I've come to do, very much influenced by the Open Recognition Alliance, is come to realize that it's actually recognition that I'm more interested in than credentials. I'm interested in the peer-to-peer relationship between people, especially when they're learning, and we're trying to get people to demonstrate behaviors which make the world a better place. So because of that, we have got a project through our cooperative called Keep Badges Weird, and you can find out more about that at badges.community, and it links to a community you can join. There's over 300 people in there now. We launched it last year. And there's also a wiki that uses the same wiki software as Wikipedia, and that's at badge.wiki. So if you're interested in this and you're listening to this and you're thinking, I understand like badges for credentialing, but I don't really understand what you mean by recognition. Well, we'll dig into it more in this podcast, but also go and have a look at badges.community, because there's a whole group of people who are figuring it out together.
So 2 things on this, at least 2. So when the verifiable credentials, they are under the W3C standard. So this also means that they are in a very stable format, and they stay stable to a certain degree, at least, or they will be compatible, like HTML, the language of the browsers, and the internet is still the old versions would run, even though they are looking quite ugly on our compared. Yeah. So this means that there will be most probably quite a compatibility and no risk to lose these badges in the future. Right.
Yeah, so they're backwards compatible. Version 2 and 2.1 of the standard were compatible, or backwards compatible with version 1. But I don't know if you're a gamer, but in different versions of consoles, you get consoles being more or less backwards compatible with previous generations. So, for example, I play on the PlayStation 5, I can play PlayStation 4 games and stuff. Sometimes they break that compatibility between console generations, and the same is happening between version 3 of the Open Badges standard and version 2, but that's so it can be, forwards thinking and future compatible. You're still going to be able to put version 2 and version 3 badges in the same backpack or wallet. It's just that you'll have to decide between the two a little bit more. But we can get into that, or you can go and read about that in a bit more detail. Your question about W3C, yes, so they have a data model for verifiable credentials. That document has a lot of diagrams in, if you go and have a look for it, which is quite interesting, especially in terms of the different use cases for verifiable credentials. I'm sure people listening to this would have an idea in their mind about the kind of situations you could use that, but it goes even beyond there. And there's a working group, which I'm kind of on the edges of, called VC Edu, which has a mailing list and meets up usually every Monday. And they are thinking about use cases specifically in education and training. So that might be something that people listening to this might want to be aware of as well.
Yeah, the other thing that you mentioned with open recognition, this triggered also a thought in my head. So people think often about skills and how to measure skills, and and it's quite hard to really identify if someone has a skill or not. And people often say that it's more value adding to collect something like recognition, for example, in LinkedIn, where you can endorse people. I've seen that Doug is a good podcast guest on credentials, for example, right? And this is more value adding than some kind of official exam that I did 30 years ago, or some, that I worked somewhere, but really people talking about or confirming that I have certain capabilities or skills would be way more powerful. So is this also going in this direction?
Yeah, I think that's spot on, actually. So when you think about recognition or the value, or when we talk about other people, when we talk about skills, there's always a temptation to try and create some kind of skills taxonomy and try and fit people into a skills taxonomy. Whereas I guess recognition is starting from the person and the value that they bring without trying to fit them into a skills taxonomy. So we make value judgments about people all the time, from the way they dress to the cars they drive. Who they've worked for is also a massive indicator, because if you think about it, so I could introduce myself as Dr. Belshaw, and some people would be impressed by that and some people wouldn't. I could introduce myself as having worked for Mozilla, which other people who know what Mozilla is might be impressed with. What we're usually interested in is what filters people have been through and what's come out the other side. So it could be, oh, well, if Doug got hired for this organization, he must know some stuff. Or if Doug's got this degree, he must know his stuff. But often we just ask people if someone's good to work with, for example, or we looked at LinkedIn recommendations. And I guess it's the difference between quantitative kind of fitting people inside of a taxonomy and the kind of qualitative, actually, Matthias is a great podcast host or whatever. There's no skill we're talking about there or threshold to meet, but we are recognizing that actually he's got the behaviors and the dispositions and the warmth and all of these things that we couldn't maybe quantify, but we think is really valuable. We can package those up in interesting ways as well.
Yeah, makes sense for me. What I'm currently wondering about a little bit is, so I know some aspects why it's relevant for learning professionals, but why would you say it's also a very important topic that learning professionals look into this topic of credentials and recognition?
Well, there's a couple of things here. So learning and development departments are often quite close to HR, human resources. And both of those organizations have problems to solve. So learning development is often underfunded, unfortunately, within organizations. And HR always has the problem on repeat of keeping hold of talent and also getting new talent into the business. So one way that we hire people is to look at CVs or resumes, and also we interview people and we give them tests and that kind of thing. Now, if we can put the means of credentialing and recognition into the hands of everyone, it means that when people come to interview, it's not just the people who are good at interviews who we hire. Yeah. It also means that whereas CVs and resumes are a bunch of claims about what you can do, badges and verifiable credentials are a bunch of evidence about what you can do. So, for example, let's use the example of a podcast host or someone building a wall or something like that. I could say, Matthias is a great podcast host, or Doug can build a wall. And I could say those things, but if I can link to evidence showing you that actually here's Matthias hosting a podcast or here's Doug building a wall, it's a bunch of evidence rather than a bunch of claims about things. And we know that people lie on their CVs. We know that. The other thing that it does, and the other reason that learning professionals should pay attention to it, is they can individualize people's ability to show what they can do in the world. I talked earlier about fitting people into a skills taxonomy, and sometimes that's a really important thing to do, and I'm not saying that shouldn't happen. But it also allows you, when you do recognition, it can foreground interpersonal relationships. So instead of just showing where you sit in a hierarchy, it shows how you interact with your peers, both within the organization and also more widely within your sector and within the landscape. Because ideally, I should imagine, most organizations want people who can get on well with other people and have an impact within the sector in which they work. And those two things can be foregrounded by badges and credentials based on open recognition. The last thing I'd say is that it's not just about skills. Often when people see badges and credentials, they think skills. But I want to help people understand that it's also about what I would call pro-social behaviors and dispositions. So people who come to the aid of other people who make other people's lives easier, people who put in place processes so things work better. You could break those down into skills, but essentially they're behaviors and dispositions and ways of being rather than skills. And we can capture those as well.
And this also means that badges or credentials based on classroom training are not that they can also be valuable, but they are not that much value adding than really confirming things that you have observed and reality, right? And in a training you can say that people have attended the training. Yeah, this is good for the basics, but this doesn't mean they have the competency or they show a certain behavior, right?
Yeah, so that's right. So what badges are really interesting, the reason they're really interesting is that when organizations start having conversations about badges, they start talking about what they value and recognize. And that's very interesting in and of itself. And then they will make a badge system. And that first badge system that they make, if they don't have any help from outside, etc., will probably be terrible and will probably be based on something like bronze, silver, and gold, or traffic lights, or something like that. And the reason that those badge systems usually aren't very good is because they're supply-side badge systems. And what I mean by that is they're not focused on the user, on the learner, on the person at the other end of that. So something I haven't mentioned so far is that I worked for Moodle for a couple of years between 2018 and 2020. So I was a product manager there. And when you're a product manager, you have to think about the person who's using this. You have to do user testing and user research and all that kind of stuff. When you're designing a badge system, you shouldn't be doing the badge system to somebody, just like, with training and learning. You need to include and find out what it is that the learner needs to be able to do in their lives. Like, what is it that they want to be able to achieve, and how are the badges or the credentials or the recognition you're giving them enabling them on their own path towards greater fulfillment, satisfaction, abilities, career, whatever it is. And so it's almost like a little mini product development thing that you're doing when you're doing badge system design. So, for example, you could give out badges, like you said. You could give out badges for attending a workshop or finishing a course. And that's great, and that's absolutely fine, and that's probably going to be quite useful for some people. But maybe more interesting is to think about those behaviors that you're trying to encourage. So if you're trying to encourage people to have an impact on the climate crisis, well, think about, instead of telling people what to do, giving people recognition for coming up with ideas on how to fight it, rather than telling people how they should fight it, that kind of stuff. An example would be in the Keep Badges Weird community that I was talking about before. We've got some badges in there, and some of them are just listed. These are the badges that you can earn. And some of them are stealth badges. So you don't know that you're about to earn this badge, but it's just issued to you you receive it unexpectedly. For example, in Germany, David Hasselhoff's a big name. Yeah, we've got one called the Hofmeister badge with a little kind of David Hasselhoff holding one of those Baywatch little flotation devices, and that is for people who come to the assistance of others. It's a little bit of fun. It's a little bit of a stealth badge. Another one is a Harmony Keeper badge, and we issue that badge for any time when someone's diffused some kind of confrontation or any kind of argument between people in the community. And so it's really important for people who are receiving that badge that they know what they can do with it. So in the very early days of badges, loads of badges were issued to people who had literally never heard of badges before and didn't know what to do with them. And unsurprisingly, a lot of those badges went unclaimed. And some people thought, oh, well, that means that badges are unsuccessful. Nobody wants them. But it's like with anything. If you don't tell people what things are for and why they're valuable and what you to do with them, then they're not going to know what to do with them. And if you don't involve them in that almost product development cycle, well, you're not going to develop badges that people are going to think are useful anyway.
Yeah, this already gives me some good idea of the use cases and also on some of the do's and don'ts, like don't do silver, gold, bronze badges and so on. Because I know a good example from a large consulting company, which I thought before is already a good approach, because they say if you attend the training, you get the bronze one. If you show certain or attended or you delivered in a project something really special based on the learnings, you get a different one and so on. So up to platinum. But sounds like this might not be the perfect way.
Yeah, and what I'd say to people, because I've done a lot of badge system design over the last 11 years or so, is that when it's quite disingenuous for people who have got to a certain level or got to a certain job to turn around and think about their career and then create a badge system which doesn't look like this, how they got to where they are. So people when you look back at your life or your career or whatever, you tell a story which is a little bit different to how you actually went through it, how it felt at the time. So, I think it was Kierkegaard who said life must be lived forward, but must be understood backwards. So when we look back at our career, we kind of make it look really like it was all going to be obvious and it's all like this was intentional all the time. And then we create badge systems where we force people to jump through hoops that we didn't really jump through ourselves. And so I think it's much more interesting to allow people to follow their interests. So a metaphor which I often use, and maybe will be understandable if I describe it just in audio, is in my local town where I live, there are stepping stones across a river. And if you think about that as being like a badge system, you could create a badge system where literally you go onto the first stepping stone and then you finish that one, then you go onto the next one all the way across the river. And if you fall off, well, you have to dry yourself off and start again and go across the river. But the way that I like to think about it, two different ways. If I'm helping people go from that stepping stone metaphor to another one, I would use the game called Trivial Pursuit. I don't know if you've come across this game, but it's you get like a little circular pie and you have to put like little cheeses or segments or whatever you want inside there. And what that means is that the learner themselves gets to choose what order or which colors to put inside there, which is a nice way of giving them some agency. But ideally, I'd love a situation where we end up, if you look up into the stars in the sky and you think about all the different ways in which people have come up with ways of understanding the links between those stars. Now, the links between those stars do not exist in real life. It's only us looking at them which makes sense of constellations. And so if we can come to a stage where we can create badges where learners themselves can make the links between them and create their own pathways, for me, that is the ultimate destination that we're going to. And not just badges maybe that you're issuing at your organization either. So one of my colleagues, Laura Hilliger at We're Open Co-op, she, I think, went to several institutions for her higher education. And she often had to start again when she was going through all those different universities because there was no portability of her learning. Can you imagine if you had a badge system where you could learn some stuff in this institution or this organization and then build upon it somewhere else and ultimately maybe get a meta level, a higher level badge because of a pathway that you yourself have designed? And I think that, for me, especially for my kids, for the kind of learning I want to do, the communities I'm part of, that's where we want to be headed.
And this also then means then if you can choose your own way or only display the badges basically that you want, that reflect what you want to show, then it might even be okay that people don't claim certain badges if they don't fit into their what they want to show, right?
Yeah. That's right. And you might be listening to this thinking, well, hang on a minute, there would have to be millions of badges that in existence for this to happen. Well, there already are. So that's the starting point. But you can start really easily with just a single badge. So I can say to you, Matthias, what would you like to learn over the next year? And let's design a badge together just for you. Just literally for you on what you want to earn. And you're going to work towards this badge over the next year. And then if you think, well, that's actually quite a lot of things to be doing for one badge, well, let's break it down into smaller bits. And we did this for our intern last year. And we'd come up with a badge system before she started. And when she started, she's actually German as well, Anna Helliger, Laura's niece. And we ended up co-designing and changing the badging system because of the things that she wanted to learn and the stuff that she was curious about. And so this is kind of the opposite of a hierarchical, top-down, let's decide what the badges are in advance kind of approach. So I think you can have both, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, quite interesting. In Germany, we have a corporate learning community, so an open community of learning professionals. And we also thought about, shouldn't we have a badge system for our community? And thought, when does it make sense? Like attending a session at a bar camp, is this worth a badge? Who wants to do something with this badge, right? And then we should have it only for the organizers of the community. But then it would only be for people. But something like you said, it's more valuing the colleagues that organize the complete community would be more meaningful because they also show a certain behavior than just they might have attended a certain barcamp session.
That's right, and they could reflect on what they've learned. It might not just be the fact they attended, but they, joined a podcast or wrote a blog post or did a thread on social media about what they learned. In 2013, there's a Linux distribution called Fedora. And they started a badging system. So this is now 9 years ago, I guess. And they came on one of the Mozilla community calls and said, look, we're going to start issuing badges for people who submit pull requests on our Linux distribution. And that was great and fine. But they started somewhere. And since then, if you go to, I've put a link for your show notes, you can put in there. They have hundreds of badges now for attending events, for the number of pull requests, for writing a blog post that got more than 1,000 views, for being the project leader, for helping other people out who are new to the community, for all different kinds of stuff. And when they started this badge system, the kind of older, more grizzled members of the community thought, well, what's the point of this? Like, we've been getting on fine without it. And when they started noticing that the younger and the newer members of the project were getting badges, they thought, hang on a minute, these people who are new to the community can show to people outside the community that they're part of this and that they've done some stuff. And then they started wanting some badges as well. So you have to start somewhere. And even if people say, what's the point? Then eventually, so long as you're meeting people's needs, you'll find that people come on board.
And I also understood you can really start simple. So if we are talking about L&D again, even though I understood that certifying attending a training is not the best badge, it still is, and it's from my point of view also better than a paper certificate that I hide somewhere in a folder.
Well, I don't think anyone can ever say something is a bad badge, because every badge is going to have value somehow. For example, if you were in the room when when there was a conversation that happened, let's say the 2010 in Barcelona, there was a conversation in the corner of a room about, wouldn't it be great if we had like badges for learning online? And I wasn't part of that conversation because I didn't work for Mozilla at the time. But imagine if you were in that conversation and you were at that event and you got a badge for that event where a conversation happened and you were present and it turned into this big thing. If you could prove that you were there right at the beginning, that badge retrospectively gains a lot more value. And
not
also
at the moment, but later.
And also like there's stories that we tell ourselves, like I said before, about our career. And sometimes badges have a lot of value to people, either retrospectively, or they just give people some confidence to go and pursue something. They give a little bit of encouragement. So I've got 2 kids. The more that I encourage them about sport or about art or about anything really, the more likely they are to persist at it because they've had some feedback and some recognition for it. So if you can recognize people for the kinds of things that your organization wants them to get better at, then they're more likely to want to get better at it too, I would say.
Yeah, very nice. And it also shows the others that this is behavior that was recognized, right? And maybe create some pull effects that others also want to be recognized for this kind of behavior, right?
Yeah, and this is something I think we're going to talk about anyway, but in terms of benefits for different groups, we're issuing some badges at the moment for organizations which are under the umbrella of Sport England. So Sport England is the organizing body for sport in England. There's like Basketball England and England Hockey and whatever. So we're helping them work more openly. And we're issuing badges for that. You can find that on our website. Now, they are then, people who are earning those badges are then sharing those badges on LinkedIn, on social media, within their organizations. And it's almost like free marketing for the work that we're doing. Because people are proud to earn these things. The link takes them back to our work if people want to earn their badges again. Like for training suppliers and providers and for L&D departments, that's amazing. You're getting, you're getting free marketing, basically.
People not only see that someone earned a badge, but they also see where they got it, right? And if you have an internal academy, for example, in a corporate, people in LinkedIn would see, they learned I run a IT academy in Bayer, for example. So they learned it in Bayer at the IT academy. This might be positive external visibility on the labor market for, they provide good training. And on the other hand side, also showing all the colleagues, there is a good offering available that people used. So also this, it's an additional marketing effect.
And over time, people, you have signals within a marketplace. So we talked earlier about the signals that we send other people by the clothes that we wear and the cars that we drive and the house that we have and all that kind of stuff. But also certain qualifications have signals in the marketplace as well. So in my country, if you said you've been to Oxford or Cambridge University, well, the door is open, please come in, that kind of thing. Badges can be like that as well. So getting a badge around a particular training from one organization is likely to be much more valuable than getting literally the same kind of training from a different provider, because the person who trained you at Bayer was actually the industry expert. So if I get a badge from them, well, again, the door is open because we recognize that people who've got that badge are going to be much better than people who have had this training over there. So it's just a way of kind of surfacing that information as well.
No, I got a good idea of what badges can be used for, and the recognition and the credentials part I also understood. And I also understand that you are very positive about this thing, but still, do you also see some disadvantages when talking about badges and credentials?
Yeah, so there's two. One of them if it depends who you talk to. If you talk to me, I would say that there's mainly two, and one of them has been dealt with. So the first one, which has been dealt with, is that usually badges historically have been tied to email addresses. So the identifier on a badge is tied to your email address, and if you leave an organization, that can make it tricky in terms of verifying that, etc. So, for example, when I left Mozilla, I had lots of badges which were issued to me at Mozilla, as you can imagine. And then I had to get them reissued to me, et cetera, et cetera. Now, with verifiable credentials, you have what are called decentralized identifiers. So this is not blockchain, but it is cryptographic. And you have a decentralized identifier. You control a wallet, and you can have multiple decentralized identifiers, and you just have to show that you control that identifier. And therefore, you can that's portable between whatever institution that you have or whatever email address that you own. This is very new. The Open Badges 3.0 standard was literally ratified a couple of months ago. So people are still testing this out, and it's kind of the direction of travel. So most of the badges which are issued now would be issued to email addresses, but that's changing. The second disadvantage of badges, but this is not just open badges or verifiable credentials, but any time when you put an extrinsic motivator on an intrinsic motivator, is that all of the research that I've seen is that if it's a child, if it's an adult in the workplace, whatever it is, if somebody was already intrinsically motivated to do something, like learn this thing, develop this skill, do their homework, whatever it is, if you start putting an extrinsic motivator on there in terms of a badge, it tends to crowd out that intrinsic motivator. So, for example, let's use a really basic, homely example. I have a 15-year-old son who likes chocolate and sweets, okay? If he came home from school and started doing his revision every night as an intrinsic thing that he wanted to do, I wish he would do that, but if he came home from school doing that, and then all of a sudden I said, hey, if you do 2 hours of revision, I'm going to give you some chocolate. Yeah. Well, if I stop giving him the chocolate, his motivation disappears. When previously he was already motivated to do it. Yeah. And I see this, interestingly, when my daughter plays football. I see parents giving an amount of money if they score a goal. And in the long run, it actually disincentivizes them to do the thing. Yeah. You have to build up the intrinsic motivation. So the thing that you need to do if you're issuing badges is to make sure that any badges that you issue aren't replacing the intrinsic motivation that someone else has. Instead, it's extending it or helping them become curious in a different area.
In general, I would say if someone is intrinsic motivated and gets a thank you afterwards, this usually is more supporting the intrinsic motivation, and isn't there an open recognition more like a thank you, just a public thank you? But do you get addicted to it? I don't know, but will it really be more developing in extrinsic motivation? I want to gain badges. I think the secret badges that you mentioned could be helpful there because you don't know that they are there. You only get them as a thank you, but you cannot try to get them, right?
Yeah, and what you said there about I want to get more badges, let's go back to the Fedora badges example. It's the difference between I want to be helpful to my community or I want to learn more stuff versus I want to earn more badges. If the badges become the thing which is motivating you, then whoever's designed the badges has done it incorrectly.
I could simply go to GitHub and issue a pull request with nonsense, right? Most probably they won't accept it, but...
Exactly that. The one thing that I haven't mentioned so far, actually, is that, and this is fascinating because I don't know how this is going to play out. With verifiable credentials, you don't have to have a badge image. It's optional. So at the moment, with Open Badges version 2.1, in terms of the metadata that goes into the badge, like, the name of the badge, the description, the criteria, who it's issued to, all that kind of stuff, one of the mandatory fields is the badge image. But with verifiable credentials, you don't have to have that badge image. So it might look a lot more like a decentralized version of LinkedIn recommendations, for example. So instead of those recommendations being tied to one particular platform, rather they exist in a wallet, which is controlled by your decentralized identifier, and you can take those throughout your career, whatever platform you're using.
Yeah, this was also something which I always wondered. Okay, you can hire a designer to create a badge for you, but if you do this for every small activity, then it can get costly or they get ugly, right? Or they all look the same, then it's not adding that much value. But if it's working without images, this could also improve it.
It's often it's often the thing that people get most hung up on, especially if they work in an organization and they have to have brand guidelines and that kind of stuff. It's a big blocker for people. So that's one way around that, I think. It's quite interesting. The other thing that you could do, especially if you're like, well, I want to get started issuing badges right now, but I want them to look good, but I haven't got budget for, whatever. I've been experimenting, I'm sure, like lots of people, with things like DALL-E and Midjourney and AI art generation platforms. You can literally type in the word patch or badge or something like that at the end of your prompt. And I've come up with quite good-looking images based on that. So you could do that too.
Yeah. I haven't thought about this. I just did some sketchnoting and thought my sketch notes are ugly, and then I tried to have Dolly do some sketch notes for me. This was more or less good, but you could have them create a badge. Yeah, right. Maybe not again. Brand guidelines would be difficult, but for basic sense,
exactly. When you're messing about and testing them and stuff, but you can actually. I was looking at this morning. Actually, you can. Create your own drawing, upload that as a starting image, and then get it to iterate based on that.
Can I issue a badge for myself, to myself?
Yes, you can.
It would be possible, right?
Yeah, so you can issue a badge to yourself, and someone applied for a job at Mozilla when I was there, entirely using self-issued badges. The reason that's interesting is because, and I think. It's a funny thing to talk about because you think, oh, well, what can be the value of a self-issued badge? But if you're entirely self-taught, if you're a programmer who's entirely self-taught, if you can package up your learning in a way which has value which shows value to other people, that's actually quite a useful thing to do. I mentioned Badge Wiki before. On the Badge Wiki website, if you type in pathways, there was actually a Mozilla Discover project which was trying to create badges based literally on the pathways that people had to be a developer and all the different twists and turns they'd had along the way. So you can issue a badge to yourself. And another thing which we haven't talked about so far is that you can get other people to endorse your badge. So I might be a teacher or a trainer, and I might be issuing a badge. I could get my organization to endorse that, or an awarding body. I could self-issue a badge and then get someone else to kind of validate that and endorse it. All of these different possibilities are available, and it's kind of the only limitation is our imagination. Like, it's not just replacing certificates; it's an entirely different ballgame.
And this, I think, getting people to endorse your badge is maybe easier than convincing more people to issue badges for you. And what I think is also quite important is that you have a certain scale so that more companies and providers and people use it actively, right? So that you have a certain scale that it's normal and really not something that is only in certain tech areas known.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the value of pretty much anything is how it's used. And so if you're like, well, that's a great idea and maybe we'll use it for this project far in the future, well, that's great. But you can use these things here and now, and they'll often have unexpected value to you. So the value of a badge or a badge system within your organization is going to be different inside of mine, etc. But the value for the whole ecosystem and for society is that it shows the value of people and of ideas and of things that people are doing. It allows you to capture that value and show it outside of your community. And I think that's a really useful thing to do.
And you said you could start basically now if you want.
For sure, yeah.
So how do I start? So if I want to issue a badge today, what do I do?
So if I was going to issue a badge to you today, Matthias, I would go to Badger, which is the one which we tend to use most. So we issue badges through Open Badge Factory and Participate, and I think there's like 30 other different platforms as well. Badger was actually recently acquired by the organization behind Canvas and Structure. So it's currently free, but who knows what's going to happen in the future. So on Badger, we have set ourselves up as an organization. I can press Create New Badge. I'm going to add an image, and I'm just going to create a little one just using a little tool of which there's lots online. I could use Canva. I could use, there's dedicated badge creators. I'm going to create an image, maybe some headphones, and I'm going to put awesome podcast host. And I'm going to put in a name, awesome podcast host, a description. This badge is issued to anyone who hosts podcasts awesomely. I'm going to put a criteria in. This person must have hosted at least one podcast. They must have done it well and whatever the criteria is. And then once I've created the badge, there's a couple of things I can put in there if I want to. And then I've got the badge. I'm going to type in your email address and your name. I'm going to put in some extra words as to why I've issued this badge to you. And I'm going to press send. And you're going to get an email saying, Doug's issued, or in that case, it'll be We Are Open has issued you a badge. And you might look at that and see the explanation. And you can choose to either download that to your computer or you can choose to put it somewhere. And the default place to put it is the place that I've issued it from, which would be Badger. But if you've already got a wallet or a backpack, you can put it through into that. And you can create a profile. You can share it on LinkedIn. You can share it anywhere online. And then you've got that kind of credential, that recognition that someone believes that you've done something well or has a particular disposition or way of being or behavior.
And as the learner, I just need this wallet either on Badger or on one of the other wallet systems so that I can collect all the badges.
In the early days, Mozilla had what was called the Mozilla Backpack, and the idea that it would be a bit like, the Fediverse and Mastodon. It would be a federated system like email where you could move badges between them. Now, that didn't work out, and actually Mozilla should have let go of that idea a lot sooner. But there are lots of places where you can host your badges, and the most obvious places are on systems where you can issue badges to. So Open Badge Factory has Open Badge Passport, which is available as an app as well. Badger has it. On Participate, you can show on your profile within the community, that kind of thing. The Participate example is particularly interesting because Participate is a platform around communities of practice. And I think a lot of people who are listening to this will be interested and already know the term community of practice. And so issuing badges for recognition within a community of practice really does go hand in glove with what we're trying to achieve in terms of learning and development. So it's worth looking at all the different platforms in terms of what you're trying to achieve through your badging system.
And there are also some larger companies, if you're a large corporation, that you can reach out to. I think there's Credly or something like this, and some larger companies, right?
So Credly would be one that enterprise level people issue badges through. So IBM, for example, issue badges through Credly. So does City and Guilds, who are a large awarding body in the UK. They're owned by Pearson. So it depends on what your thoughts are around Pearson. And then there's lots of other organizations that issue badges as well. For example, Moodle has had the ability to issue badges for the last 10 years now through the LMS. So if you're doing cohorts of learners and you've already got Moodle as an LMS, then maybe you want to issue badges through Moodle. So lots of different options.
What I came across a few times is people are talking more about Web 3.0 and NFTs. So the Pro Apps proof of attendance protocol thing, where you also basically, for me, it's also kind of badges. What are your thoughts on this new trend?
How long have we got? So I've hung out in these spaces, before it was cool. And also since it's been cool with people over in the US when I've been at conferences and stuff. And the question which I always ask, and I keep asking until they answer it, and they never answer it, is why do you need a blockchain for that? And it is always a solution looking for a problem. Yeah, I have got a doctoral certificate on my wall. It is one of the highest, inverted commas, badges you can get. I have never needed a blockchain for that. I only need a database. Yeah. So I don't think you need a blockchain for badges. And I think that Web3 is a dangerous commodification, and it's a logical end of capitalism in terms of trying to make literally every transaction between people, every interaction between people into a transaction. And I find that problematic. I have made money from cryptocurrency, don't get me wrong. But like, I just don't see the application of blockchain for badges. If you want to do that, if you want to put badges on a blockchain, do it, but make sure you fully understand what you're letting yourself in for with GDPR, for example, because blockchains are immutable. If you want to take something down, that's going to be problematic. There are platforms which allow you to issue blockchain-based badges. MIT had a whole thing called BlockCerts. I've still, 11 years later, not found a need for putting a blockchain on anything.
I even understood that you can then transfer this kind of badges in the blockchain to others, but then it still shows the original owner. And so, yeah, I also don't get it completely.
That's great. So what you just described there is transferring an asset, essentially, from one person to another. So I totally get that. So blockchains for asset management, that's great. But I just don't understand a situation where someone would issue you a badge for learning, for example, and you'd want to transfer that to somebody else.
Don't know why. I also don't get the use case, but maybe we will find out in the future, or it will vanish. Two options, right?
Well, we'll see.
Yeah, so we touched a little bit on the history of credentials, how it started. Do you like to share a little bit more detail on this?
Yeah, sure. So 2010, I think I mentioned before, the Mozilla Drumbeat Festival in Barcelona. Some people gathered in the corner of a room. I was still working in schools at that time. 2011, the MacArthur Foundation runs a pilot and sees whether this is something which could be done amongst developers. I came across it working in higher education, thought this is amazing. I ran like an online course around it, etc. 2012, I was invited to San Francisco to be one of the judges for the DML competition. We gave out $2 million of seed funding for lots of different ideas, all different kinds of things. Too many to kind of go into specifics. 2013, version 1 of the Open Badges specification. 2014, the Badge Alliance was set up. So this was spun out of Mozilla as a separate organization. 2015, IBM, Microsoft started to adopt Open Badges. There's 14 working groups around all different kinds of areas. And by 2016, you had millions of Open Badges issued to hundreds of thousands of people. There was also something called the Bologna Open Recognition Declaration around ways badges could be used differently to credentials. 2017, the Badge Alliance kind of folded, and One EdTech, which used to be called IMS Global Learning Consortium, took over stewardship of the Open Badges standard. Now, One EdTech is a non-profit, but also it's a membership organization, so it very much changed the community ethos. So the community around Open Badges just kind of withered away a little bit. 2018, version 2 of the spec. By that point, 24.1 million badges had been issued. 2019, Mozilla retired that backpack I was talking about before. They should have done that a lot earlier. They migrated all their users to Badger. And I think from then on, from 2020 onwards, especially during the pandemic, people started to get why badges would be really useful. So whereas before people had been like, I'm not sure about this, that's when you start getting this plateau of productivity. And version 2.1 of the specifications, over 30 organizations are now certified in terms of adoption of the Open Badges standard, along with lots of other plugins and stuff. And 2022, we're now version 3 of the Open Badges specification. And by this point, I'm guessing, because it's a decentralized system, so who really knows, I should imagine there are hundreds of millions of badges being issued at this point to millions and millions of people, which is amazing, really.
And now, having looked at the history, maybe also a look into the future. So what do you think, how will this develop in the near future, or maybe in the next 2 to 5 years? What do you think? I know it's not easy.
It's difficult to. I always thought it was going to take 10 years to for badges to be a thing, and the reason for that is I remember 1996, 7, finding out about Bluetooth and thinking, "Oh my goodness, the world's going to be amazing in the future," and it taking 10 years for Bluetooth on mobile phones and stuff to be a thing. So I knew it was going to take a while. So I'm thinking by 2030. Verifiable credentials will be everywhere. It's just something which people will be talking about. And probably by 2025, at the end of 2022 now, it's quite likely that lots of countries will have verifiable credentials for driving licenses and passports and things like that. And when we think about credentials are always to do with identity or proof that you did a thing. That's what credentials are for. But in terms of open recognition, I think that's more exciting. I think that if you think about, I mentioned the example of Mastodon before. Mastodon is a federated, decentralized network, as opposed to Twitter, which is centralized. If you think about the decentralization of recognition and how we can do peer-to-peer recognition, that becomes fascinating to me, instead of just always relying on institutions and organizations to do those credentials. Yeah.
I think if there's a user interface and a easy integration in some of the larger systems where it makes sense to have this kind of things, and then it will really give it a boost, I think. Yeah.
And for sure.
Or if it somehow really gets through that, everyone will issue badges to others to recognize their behaviors or their abilities. Yeah.
I think so. And as soon as you don't have to have an image for this, I'm really excited. Yeah. At first, when I saw that, I thought, is that going to be problematic? But actually, I think we could have a real flourishing of badges which aren't image-based. And that might be a really useful thing to do.
And you, I think, also need to be able to stack them or combine them somehow together, like the Trivial Pursuits image that you had, so that you can pile them together and say these are combining something. Makes then even more sense, I think, to show it if you have too many.
And give people options. So, if you, if you earn 3 of these 5 badges, you can move on to the next bit and you can choose what that next stage is. Like I said before, I'm a gamer, so think about this in terms of skill trees. When you're, making your little goblin stronger, are you going to make them more intelligent or a better fighter or more health or whatever? And we can learn a lot from games design as well.
And there also you get badges for achievements, right?
For sure, yeah. Like I play a lot of FIFA. There's all different kinds of skill trees on that as well.
I didn't manage the tutorial of FIFA, so I'm out from football. Okay, so looking at the time, I think we slowly come to the end. So at the end, I always have 2 closing questions. One is the topic of curiosity is quite an important driver for learning. And I want to capture some inspirations on what makes people curious. So what makes you curious?
So I started off my career as a history teacher. And looking back, what I realized is that I love history and I love philosophy and stuff, but I really enjoy thinking about the way that technology impacts learning and society. Like technology is a mediator for how people come together to learn new things. So that's why I found it interesting then. And then these days, I'm really curious about how, like, what I would call appropriate technologies can be used. So not like let's put a blockchain or anything, but like technology, not for its own sake, but like the kinds of technologies which are going to bring forward the kind of society and world which I think is important. And I guess underneath it all, I'm a bit of an anarchist. And I don't mean in terms of like anarchy and anything goes. So if I can just quote from Wikipedia for the benefit of people who might not have read this before. Anarchism is a political philosophy and a movement which is skeptical of all justifications for authority and seeks to abolish the institutions it claims maintain unnecessary coercion and hierarchy, typically including, though not necessarily limited to, governments, nation-states, and capitalism. End of quote. And it's been a slow journey towards that, but I recognize actually that my interest in technology and decentralization and peer-to-peer learning and my rejection of authority is actually an anarchist stance. And I think some people listening to this will be appalled by this. But other people might be thinking, actually, that describes me as well. And no matter what your political philosophy is, badges kind of can work, and verifiable credentials can work with whatever approach you've got in life, I guess.
Maybe it also always depends a little bit on the area you're talking about. Not everything is allowed, but in some areas, autonomy is also quite important, right?
Yes, and I think we've had a lot less. We've got a lot more authoritarianism and a lot less autonomy in the world, and I think we should flip that.
And do you also have recommendation for a book?
Yes. Now, I read a lot of books, and I used to work in bookshops as well. So This is a hard question to answer. And in fact, it's a question which we ask people as the first question on our podcast that we run for We Are Open. So I've done a lot of thinking about this, and I want to recommend 2 books as being related to the kind of topic that people, listening to this podcast might be interested in. The first one is called Badass: Making Users Awesome by Kathy Sierra. Now, if you've been around the internet for a while, you might recognize Kathy Sierra's name because she used to write a blog called Making Users Awesome. And unfortunately, there were some trolls, some awful misogynistic trolls who kind of meant that she stopped blogging. But she wrote this book called Badass, and it is fantastic. It's got lots of images in. It talks about deliberate practice. It talks about giving people superpowers. And it talks about perceptual knowledge. So people's ability to get to know things without being taught, right? So the example she gives, 2 examples. One is like if you're picking up chickens to decide what sex they're going to be, that's quite a hard thing to learn how to do. But the more chickens you pick up and have a look at, and someone behind you says, that's male, that's female, the more that you just learn by looking at it. Same with bomber planes during the Second World War. So they found out that it was really hard to teach people just by the sound of the noise or whatever. But if you just literally went out with people and said, that's a bomber plane, that's not a bomber plane, that is, that's not, people would learn just from its experiential perceptual knowledge. So she talks about the power of that and just immersing people in that environment.
I read about a certain similar phenomenon. If someone is giving you out cards, and there is a certain probability higher that you get like red or black cards. After 10 or so, you indirectly already know that there is a certain bias in the cards, and quite interesting, psychological effect. And you only really recognize the effect like 40 pages later, but you quite early already have a gut feeling for it.
Yeah, and going back to FIFA, for example, that game that we were talking about earlier, my daughter plays for an academy, a football academy, and she's very good at football. She learned the offside rule, not from a coach teaching her or from me teaching her, but by playing FIFA a lot. Because, she didn't need someone to teach her what the definition of offside was. She just learned it by her player going offside a lot or whatever. So it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
The second book is, I wanted to recommend a philosophy book, but I do recognize that not everyone wants to go straight into philosophy books. So this is my kind of stealth philosophy book, and it's called 4,000 Weeks, Time Management for Mortals by Oliver Burkeman. Now, Oliver Burkeman wrote a column for the Guardian newspaper every week for about 10 years on productivity. And what he realized by writing a column for 10 years on productivity was that productivity is the wrong question to be asking. The question is like human flourishing and what it is that we want to do in life. And so this is a really philosophical but very practical book. It talks about embracing limits. It talks about doing work instead of doing lots of things in parallel, doing things in a serial way so that you get more done. And it's just a very thoughtful, reflective, awesome book that when you finished it, you feel more at ease with your life. And also, you know what it is that you need to do to actually be more productive rather than just doing lots of stuff. So both of those books together, I think, would actually make the lives of people listening to this podcast. If you finish both those books, it would make your life better.
Now I'm curious, and I will have 2 more books on my pile of books.
Very good. Very good.
Okay, thank you very much, Doug, so for all the insights and the details. So I really liked it a lot. Thank you very much.
No worries. And if people want to find out more about me or the co-op, they can go to dougbelshaw.com for me. And the co-op is just weareopen.coop. That's .coop. Thanks for having me.
And for all the listeners, thank you for listening, and see you next time, or hear you next time in the Learning Explorer podcast.